If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Psalm 32. This is where we'll be spending our time today. Psalm 32. For you and for me, for all of us in this room, there are many things I think we could point to and say, boy, the gift of salvation, what a change it's wrought in me. Look at this, look at that. And we point to things and we'd say, this is a gift that God's salvation gives to me. I think about this differently. I have this strength that I didn't have before, or whatever it might be. And there are lots of those. But I'm going to say, and this may be personal to me, I hope that it'll be of benefit to someone else. There's one aspect of being a follower of Jesus, having that relationship with God, that really, for me, tops all of them as I walk in this world. It's one thing to talk about eternal life. That's beautiful. And the freedom that that brings to us, not only looking in the future, but now, here and now. That time becomes something far more expansive and easily invested because we know we have an eternity of it. However, there's one aspect of right here and now that I find to be the greatest gift of all. And that is that there's somebody who fully knows me entirely and yet wants to be with me. Now, we know that about spouses, but there's a limit there. There is a limit. Let's take a look at our text today and see what it would show us in this way of thinking. Psalm 32, I'll begin reading in verse 1. By David, a well-written psalm. How blessed is the one whose rebellious acts are forgiven, whose sin is pardoned. How blessed is the one whose wrongdoing the Lord does not punish, in whose spirit there is no deceit. When I refused to confess my sin, my whole body wasted away, while I groaned in pain all day long. For day and night you tormented me. You tried to destroy me in the intense heat of the summer. Selah. Then I confessed my sin. I am no longer covered up my wrongdoing. And I said, I'll confess my rebellious acts to the Lord. And then you forgave my sins. Selah. For this reason, every one of your faithful followers prayed to you while there is a window of opportunity. Certainly when the surging water rises, it will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You protect me from distress. You surround me with shouts of joy from those celebrating your deliverance. Selah. I will instruct and teach you about how you should live, and I will advise you as I look you in the eye. Do not be like an unintelligent mule or a horse, who will not obey you unless they are controlled by a bridle and bit. An evil person suffers much pain, but the Lord's faithfulness overwhelms the one who trusts in him. Rejoice in the Lord and be happy, you who are godly. Shout for joy, all of you who are morally upright. All humans, we all do this. I think we should be honest within ourselves. I've heard people say they don't agree with this, but they're not connected to themselves very well when they say this. Every human being presents themselves in the way they want to be seen. Yeah. All of us, no matter where we are. Even within marriage, there's a certain amount of that goes on in a marriage. Now, marriage is the place where there's a lot more of being fully known that takes place that you don't experience if you're not married. There's a familiarity there that does stretch beyond the average familiarity that I might have with Brad or with KG or that you might have with Becky or whatever. But still, there's a limit. And I think being fully known is the only place of real rest that we can find in this world as we walk here on this earth. David is speaking here in this psalm of his sin with Bathsheba. Now, this is the second psalm that speaks of that directly, Psalm 51 being the other one. And he relates it to us what it was like for him to be in that sin and to tell us what sin is and what sin does. He tells us that sin is the transgression. Some translations have iniquity. What is that? Well, it's the breaking of the known law. And David knew the law. He knew it very well. He knew that for him to break the law regarding adultery meant he should be stoned to death, along with Bathsheba. Isn't that amazing that David knew that? He knew that adultery, and this just goes to show that no matter how much of the law we know, we still break it. And we continue to do it. We all do it. Now, I could reel off a bunch of examples where we all break the law. And I don't want to do that. I don't think it's important. Just think of a few things outside the confines of this room, and you'll realize, as I do, that we all do break the law. But isn't it amazing that within the confines of knowing the law, we still continue to break it? We just carry on with it. We don't stop. There doesn't come a point where we say, "Whoo, Shazam, I didn't know that was the law. Let me stop doing that." No, we just continue to do it. So I want to define sin in this context in a very careful way. Sin is the known will of the self to disobey the known law. Now, that doesn't mean just the codified law. Don't do this, honor your father and mother, the codified 10 Commandments. I mean the internal law as well. Nobody in this room, including me, goes through this life without defying our own conscience. We do things in a moment that we know we should not do. Our conscience is bearing witness. Paul makes that case very potently in the first 6 chapters of the letter to the Romans. So if you're confused about that, I would suggest that as a reading. But this word sin is a word that nobody in our culture likes to hear today. They don't even like the word itself. I have corresponded with people who tell me straight out there's no such thing as sin. Now, that shouldn't come as a shock to anybody that there are people who think that, because think of what it means. It means if there's no such thing as sin, there is nobody to whom I'm responsible for anything other than myself. If there's no such thing as sin, I have no responsibility to anybody other than my own self in that. I can do whatever I want, and I'm the only one that it matters. I remember when I was a young teenager. I don't know why I did this. I'm deeply ashamed of it. I really am. But we would get on our bicycles, and we would get wrist rockets, and we'd get rocks or ball bearings or marbles or whatever it was, and we would shoot the wrist rockets at things to see if they would break. People's property. We were damaging people's property. I look back on that. Do you have anything, don't raise your hand or say, but do you have anything in your life where you look back and you say, I have no idea why I did that? Why did I do that? Have you ever said something to somebody in a moment and then thought, why did I have to say that?
All the time.
All the time, right? But notice here what David gets at here. He says, I covered my sins. Sins were covered. There are 2 meanings for that term within this psalm. Now, there's a word being used in this psalm over and over and over, and it's the church word, blessed. Blessed is a church word. That's not the best translation of the Greek word from which we get our term being translated blessed at all. The term markurioi means literally happy. That's what it means. If you go read the Sermon on the Mount, it's markurioi every time. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Happy are the poor in spirit. Happy are the peacemakers. Every one of those terms in the Old and the New Testament translated blessed is the word happy. I don't like the word blessed, to be honest with you, because it's one of those words that is kind of foggy for me. I don't know how it is for you. It's a little foggy for me. I know where it comes from in terms of the concept. It comes from the Jewish term shalom. But we think about shalom as peace. Well, it's much bigger than that. Shalom incorporated everything about the person. If the person was a tent maker like Paul, it meant you were successful in your tent making. It meant you had plenty to eat. It meant that your children were healthy, your flocks were doing well, your home life was good, your marital relationship was good. That was shalom. It incorporated everything, not just one thing. And then there's another word here. The word that's translated regarding iniquity is the word that translates out to mean twisted. I really like that. That just captures for me what it is that's going on in a person who breaks God's law, who transgresses the law. They are twisted. C.S. Lewis in his Space trilogy, which I may be the only person in the room that's read those. I don't know. Brad, did you read them? Oh, the last one. Well, okay. If you read the first one, There's a planet called Malacandra, and there's this whole race of beings on Malacandra. And their word for when somebody does wrong, is committing wrongdoing, is they are bent. Lewis chose that word very carefully because it's right out of the Bible. It's what it means to do wrong, to do iniquity is to be twisted. I think that's a very descriptive term. And so here David is describing the fact that what he did with Bathsheba was twisted. It was a twisted act by a twisted psyche, by a twisted person himself. And he's relating to this from some distance. This, by the time he writes this, it's long past. It's in a distant past, and you can tell that by the text, which we'll get into in a moment. He's healed of the sin by the time he writes this. He's now able to be useful to God once again by the time he writes this. But he speaks in verses 2 to 4 of hiding the sin. That is so significant. Because if a person has a relationship to God and they sin and they hide it, they are going to be uncomfortable. And that's what he says. He says, in the midst of the sinning, I was made sick by the fact that I hid it. Isn't it interesting, though, in the midst of the sinning, there's enough comfort to carry it out? That's always a mystery to me. I mean, it's one thing to hide it and have to live with that tension, but isn't it a mystery that there's not enough tension to stop us from doing it to start with? And this period in David's life is about a year, right? Because he has, Bathsheba gives birth, all that period of time, and the text is a little ambiguous with regard to 2 Samuel where it talks about what David did, because we don't know how long this went on before she became pregnant. Doesn't tell us that. Doesn't tell us how long the period was where he was enjoying having Bathsheba and in the meantime trying to get rid of Uriah. We don't know that. So about a year, because it takes a year and 9 months for a baby to be born. So a year is a pretty good guess. And he spent that year covering the sin up, day in and day out. And by the way, David is a typical, not typical, but he is an ancient Near Eastern Oriental king. And in the ancient Near East, the king could do whatever they wanted. Whatever they wanted. Read Esther. Read Esther and see that Ahasuerus, that Persian king, has got this harem of women. Solomon had a harem of women, 700 concubines. Ahasuerus has a harem of women. That Esther joins that harem. Nobody thinks anything about it. If you came into Ahasuerus, read Esther and look how she comes into the throne room. She comes in very carefully because she might go in there, and if Ahasuerus does not extend the scepter to her, she's dead. You could die showing up for an ancient Near Eastern king. So what am I getting at here? David didn't have to excuse this behavior to anybody. He's the king. He can do whatever he wants. So this is where being Jewish and being an ancient Near Eastern king had a head-on collision for David. He could have covered this forever and nobody would have. So what? I killed Uriah. I had him killed. Big deal. I'm an ancient Near Eastern king. I can do that. Doesn't make any difference to me. They killed people all the time, had them killed, had them thrown in the hole, had them thrown into the shackles, whatever it was. But here for David, it created a problem because David is a Jew. He's a follower of Yahweh. Had Uriah killed, the baby was born, the baby died, God's not going to be mocked, is the lesson. David may be king, but he's not God. But then, as you read this text, as we just read it, there's a change that shows up. David comes to God in confession. Now, in confession, it says in the text, I acknowledged my sin. That was all it took. Right? Nathan comes in and points that finger at him. You're the man. David suddenly bursts out, I have sinned against God. And he finds relief from that which he has done. All that covering that he has done all this time, wherein he thought he had it hidden, he can release that now. It's no longer necessary because now he's confessed the thing that he's been covering up. I remember watching the movie City Slickers. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that movie. It's a funny movie. And in it, there are these three guys that go on this dude ranch vacation. They go to a ranch where you're actually going to move cattle. That's the vacation. I can't imagine why that's a vacation for anybody, but that's what they went for. You're going to be a cowboy for 2 weeks or whatever it was while they move cattle from one state to another to market. And in there, one of the three guys is really a crass person. He's been married and divorced many times. He's got a girlfriend right now. And there's a girl who's part of this entourage of vacationers. And he talks about her in the most crude way possible and says to Billy Crystal, why don't you go ahead and have some fun with her? Your wife will never know. And Billy Crystal looks at him and says, my wife would know. Well, how much more so do you think God knows when stuff like that happens? Thank God that you and I and David and anybody who'll come to him we do not have to remain in hiding any longer. Do we want that tender heart that God gives when we confess everything we've done? Daily, hourly, whatever it takes to get that job accomplished, that we come to God and keep that short account. This period of hiding was very difficult for David. The text says his body wasted away. Psalm 51 is even more graphic as to what it did to him. It does the same thing to you and me. If we have sin and it's unconfessed, it will eat away at us. If you and I know the Lord, we cannot sin and remain comfortable. It's just not possible. One poet I read, wish I'd thought of it, it's a great picture. He spoke of sin as a snake. And he said, it's a cold day and you find a snake on the ground. But when you sin, you pull the snake up into your coat and cover it up so that nobody can see it. But what happens? The snake warms up. And the snake starts to bite you over and over and over until finally you can't take it anymore and you open the coat and let the snake back out into the cold where it's stopped, into the open where it's seen. David finally opened his coat and let the snake out. That's exactly what happens here, and he brings it out so that God could see it. This brings me all the way back to the beginning of the sermon. David knew that he had sinned right away. Look at his reaction to it. What's he do? He sends her home, and then he immediately tries to figure out some way to cover all this up. Brings Uriah home 2 or 3 times, tries to get him drunk, tries to do something to get Uriah to cover up the fact that Bathsheba is now pregnant. David thought he had succeeded. But then notice the rest of this passage. He didn't succeed until he confessed his sin to God. And now David's useful to God once again. That's what the text is talking about when it says, I will instruct you now. David is saying that to you and to me and to whoever's there that he's speaking to. I will instruct you. Don't be like an animal. Don't be one who resists God. Don't be one who's so resistant that you have to be like a mule with a bridle and a bit in order to obey. Surrender to the Lord and find that place of refuge and rest and forgiveness. It says this in Psalm 88. Verses 13 and 14. As for me, I cry out to you, O Lord. In the morning my prayer confronts you. O Lord, why do you reject me and pay no attention to me? If anyone think about that. Just listen to those words. O Lord, why do you reject me and pay no attention? Can you imagine in a church service somebody standing up to pray and that's what they prayed? Lord, why do you reject me? Why don't you pay any attention to me? I bet you that person wouldn't get called on to pray ever again if it happened in a church. But how many times is that our experience in being a follower of Jesus, that we feel like God's just not paying any attention to us? And if he is, does he care? I'd say if that person got called on to pray once, that would be the end of it in a public church service. But notice the difference in David in this text. What does he close with? He closes with the fact that the forgiveness has produced in him the desire to shout because he's forgiven. The forgiveness that God's offered him causes him to want to shout. He's so overcome. And God offers that same change to anybody who will come to him when we acknowledge the sin and come to him and are cleansed. That's why the text makes way more sense when it says, happy is the person whose sin God remembers no more. So do we want that forgiveness in our life? As a believer even? Yeah, I do. Do we want to be cleansed? I do. And God offers it to anybody who will come. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I said anything